All right. Dr. David Azarad, we asked him on, he's a scholar with the Heritage Foundation. We asked him on because he has been studying the American political tradition from the founding until today. And lately he has had an emphasis on political movements, and lately he's been studying identity politics, which I think is a really, really important subject. He teaches on American conservative and progressive political thought at American University, and he writes just about everywhere. The Claremont Review of Books, which is a great review. If you're not subscribing to that, you should. National Affairs, The Times of London, Real Clear Politics, The Federalist, all the good places. Dr. Azarad, you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you for having me.
Well, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for coming on. Let's talk about identity politics. It seems to me to be an almost primitive tribalist movement. How did it rise after all the time when we talked about the melting pot? How did identity politics rise and basically replace that ideal?
It basically started to grow out of the 60s of various radical black power, black nationalist and women's liberation movements that were very critical on the one hand of the civil rights movement and the integrationist, assimilationist push of MLK, and on the other hand of the, by comparison, more modest feminism of Betty Friedan. That was basically saying, women should go out into the workforce. And you had this radical streak. It began with the African Americans and the women, and then it spread with Asians, Hispanics, homosexuals, and has blossomed into, what is probably, I think, the most dominant ideological current in America today. And you see it by the unsurpassed power it has to silence people. The fear lives within all of us. You can criticize big government, you can criticize climate change. What you cannot do in America today is deviate from the accepted script when you're speaking of protected identity groups.
It's absolutely true. I find that in and of itself egregious. I find that awful to censor people's thoughts and to kind of imprison them in their own minds with fear. But it works. It really does work. And when you can silence your opponents, you have power over them. Is there any reason they should abandon it?
Unless we stand up to them and demonstrate more courage, no, why should they? Because at this point, they barely need to silence us. We first of all silence ourselves. And then, the American conservative movement and Republicans have become very good at shooting their own people in the head when they say something that the left finds offensive. I challenge you to name the last time a Democrat had to resign because he said something that conservatives found offensive. Now, Ilhan Omar now is in trouble because she said things that Democrats find offensive. But the power of identity politics remains. So what we really need on the right is more courage, and we need to find a better way to talk about this. What I found is they want you to believe that you either do identity politics or you are callously indifferent to the well-being of citizens who don't look like you. I reject that premise. I say you can sympathize and feel solidarity with any number of your fellow Americans who have been mistreated without going down this poisonous and divisive route.
I mean, one of the things that is seriously affected, and this affects me, is humor. People get very, very nervous when you start to make racial jokes, and yet it's always seemed to me that racial humor has been a wonderful part of America and a way of dispelling the kind of natural hostility that rises up. Is there a way of speaking that can't be twisted to seem bigoted?
You need to be extremely careful. I should say, I wholly agree with you with the humor, and I found that it's been a wonderful coping mechanism for minorities. Jews tend to be pretty funny. You look at who's dominated comedy, it's mostly been Jews and African Americans, and Catholics to some extent too, I think because it's a coping mechanism for adversity. And America has completely lost its sense of humor. You know this, we all know this. But I think this, again, creates an opening for certain comedians, whether it be Seinfeld or Chris Rock, who are not conservatives, but to start to speak up against this. Because where we have an advantage is, I think that the common sense of the American people is very much with us, and that the bullies have a lot of power, but they don't have large numbers.
Do you think that there's When you talk about this, because this has been such a powerful force for the left, because the left has been able to use this, is there anyone on the left, seriously on the left, who is willing to let it go?
You know, there was one person who I kind of have an odd soft spot for, at least I did, which is a strange thing to acknowledge when you work at the Heritage Foundation, and that's Bernie Sanders.
Huh.
Because his heart and soul is not in identity politics, it's in traditional, progressive, class-based politics. He cares about the working class regardless of their skin color. And after the election, he said something really interesting, namely, one of the great challenges confronting the Democratic Party is whether or not we go beyond identity politics. He also said that, I come from the white working class and I'm deeply ashamed that the Democratic Party no longer knows how to talk to my class. The problem is he's kind of gone soft since then. And he got attacked by the left for saying this. And it's always worth remembering that he is not a Democrat. I mean, he caucuses with them, but he's not in the party. And he seems kind of shut up about this, which I think is disappointing. But I'm not seeing very many voices. If anything, I'm seeing words like intersectionality that you would find in obscure lesbian journals are now being tweeted out by elected U.S. officials in the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Isn't there a danger? It always seems to me that there's a danger that once you accept the idea that it is right and proper to group people according to their race, which seems to me an offense against morality and is certainly an offense against my religion. Once you accept that, there's every reason to expect a backlash. I mean, if you're going to say, I define myself as a black person and demand my rights as a black person, what's to stop white people from saying, well, I define myself as a white person and all white people are going to stick together and see how you like them apples?
Andrew, you've hit the nail on the head. So right now, the only reason this whole insane thing is still working is because we have identity politics for certain groups, namely women, racial minorities, the LGBTQ, but not for men, for white people, for Christians. But what happens when these groups get tired of being constantly berated, of having identities that they need to be ashamed of? What happens if they say, we're sick and tired of this, we want identity politics for everyone? Then you get tribalism. Then you get competitive ethnopolitics. And then it seems to me you just no longer have a country. I don't see what still binds the people together. The unnatural thing for human beings to do is to overcome our differences.
Right.
And to view each other as fellow American citizens. So I think we should emphasize the commonalities. And you know what? The differences will naturally take care of themselves. The Jews will want to live with Jews. The Irish will want to live with Irish. That's fine. It's a free country. You don't want the law segregating people. But we're doing the exact opposite. We're taking this dark side of human nature, the tribal side, and we're adding fuel to the fire.
It is amazing to me because it's also illogical because people say they want us to be inclusive, but in order to be inclusive, there has to be something that you include people in. So there has to be a thing that unifies us. The idea of diversity, which has now become virtually a business. I mean, if you can make a career in diversity at colleges and even in HR departments and businesses. Is diversity, is there anything positive about diversity? I mean, obviously, I like the fact that we live in a country with all kinds of people in it. That's wonderful. But is it the diversity that we're celebrating, that we should be celebrating?
I mean, I love intellectual diversity.
Yeah.
I would love to be in a room with, I don't know, let's pick an example, 6 left-handed gay black men who are all Mormons, but who have radically different views on Western history and on philosophy. Actually, that they're all Mormons is not a good. Say that they all come from different religions and could have serious, spirited theological and political debates. That's my kind of diversity. What you end up having at the universities is people look different in a superficial way, but they all think the same thing.
Right.
So, if by diversity you mean counting beans and judging people by the color of their skin, not the content of their character, I don't see how what's the greatness in that. The diversity we ought to be emphasizing is the diversity of ideas. And of course, we're an inclusive, free republic And we recognize that Americans come in a variety of skin colors and shapes and you name it. So that to me is, I don't see why you need to label that diversity. That's the idea of equal rights under the law.
Okay. I want to circle back. Before I let you go, I feel like I have to circle back to this because it's something I get asked all the time and think about a lot. What for the right, for a conservative, how do you fight back? What is a strategy? I mean, you've obviously been studying this. You've obviously been thinking about it a lot. Where do we look for the strategy instead of waiting for the left to abandon what is working for them as a power grab? What do we do? How do we face this down and turn it around?
So it's not easy, and I'm not going to give you the 30-second quick solution to all of this. But I would say the first thing we need to do is to do our homework. Let me give you a simple example. Have you ever met an elected member of Congress, a Republican, who cannot explain free markets and explain what's wrong with socialism? They may come from the most podunk district that you've never heard of. For some reason, the movement has prioritized the defense of markets. Well, for some reason. The reason's obvious. It was the Cold War and the looming threat of communism. And as a result, everyone is equipped to explain this wondrous phenomenon of markets that just don't make any sense on the surface of it. You mean if people do what they want, we generate prosperity? We got to do our homework on this one. And the risks are even higher, because if you flub an answer on free markets, the Club for Growth is not happy. If you flub an answer on identity politics, you lose your job. So I would say that the point is to do one's homework and then to realize that you don't need to debate whether or not certain groups have been mistreated in the past. In the case of African Americans, it's undeniable.
Undeniable. Yeah.
You want to focus on what do you propose? Do you want to promote alienation, say that America is hopelessly racist and demand special treatment? Or do you want to say the promise of America is justice for all? You are my fellow citizens. Let's fight to give you equal rights under the law.
Okay, I think mean you're making a good point about about arguing over the markets. It really is something that we have not embraced because I think they have succeeded in terrorizing most of the right. Dr. David Azerrad from the Heritage Foundation, really interesting. Thank you very much for coming on. I hope we get to talk again.
My pleasure. Thank you, Andrew.